This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Dissent, a democratic socialist magazine of politics and culture. Dissent's spring issue, Border Politics, is out now. The issue features a special section on the politics of immigration in the second Trump era, with articles on the sanctuary movement, the exodus from Cuba, and the abduction of Mahmoud Khalil, as well as interviews with immigration lawyers and labor leaders. The issue also includes writing on the attention economy, rebuilding democracy in Syria, the pandemic welfare state, and much more. Subscribe today to get your copy at dissentmagazine.org/subscribe. You'll get 3 issues per year, as well as digital access to 70 years of archives. That's dissentmagazine.org/subscribe. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. 5 years ago, on May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. In response, that summer witnessed the largest protest movement in U.S. history, with an estimated 15 to 26 million in the streets. Crowds didn't just well up in major cities, but gathered in small towns, in industrial suburbs, in remote hamlets. They protested. They sometimes rioted in places that hardly figure in the political geography of contemporary American radicalism. They raised demands for another world and, on occasion, took huge strides in its direction. Today, that feels like such a long time ago. In the week leading up to this interview, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor texted me, quote, "The pressing question is how we went from 26 million people on the streets to a fascist in the White House. How did such an unprecedented majoritarian breadth of anti-racist political activity so quickly transform into the far-right revanchist present?" That's what I'm discussing today with Keeanga and with organizer Asha Ransby-Sporn. As Keeanga wrote in Hammer and Hope, quote, "In the coming months and years, Black politics must do more than shape its strategy, tactics, and ideas in reaction to Trump. We need an account of what went wrong in the Black Lives Matter era. This isn't a matter of recrimination or rehashing old narratives. To move forward, we must understand what happened to the largest and most significant Black movement in 2 generations. What did we learn? What lessons can be generalized? What mistakes can be corrected? Crucial debates that have been smothered must be allowed to breathe." These questions that Keeanga asks are the sorts of questions that the entire multiracial left must explore, and that we must integrate in a more ongoing basis into our political culture. We need to make our movements and organizations spaces where self-assessment and sober appraisal are not only possible, but mandatory. The task before us, the task of building power, defeating fascism, seizing leverage, and then organizing the transformation of everything. It's just daunting, absolutely forebodingly enormous. But it is what it is. That is the task. We have a world to win, and right now, we're losing. Before we get this podcast started, we prioritize curating discussions like this because The Dig is a political education project. We plan every single show thinking hard about what sort of conversations we on the left need to better understand our world in order to change it. That's why we paywall absolutely nothing. We want everyone to listen. But that's only possible because dedicated listeners like you support the podcast at patreon.com/thedig. We also have swag to send to particularly generous contributors, and every contributor gets our occasional but very good newsletter by email. Please take a moment. If you appreciate what we do, hook us up so we can keep doing it. That's patreon.com/thedig. As always, Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com, and please rate and review us positively on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever. And lastly, as we dive into a discussion about the long tail and afterlives of explosive rebellions, I wanted to give a plug and shout out to a really exciting, excellent new magazine concerned with how we develop organization and grassroots capacity for fight back and collective strategy. That's Long Haul, a quarterly journal of rank and file worker writing, both past and present, on and off the job, and in and out of unions, put together by a team of dedicated organizers, including our very own DIG senior advisor, Ben Mabee. Long Haul is a platform for workers to reappropriate their own struggles and experiences with work, and its first 2 issues have featured Amazon strike leaders breaking down the contradictions of lean production, Teamsters describing how Sean O'Brien's flirtation with Trump impacts shop floor solidarities, and efforts to recover another model of worker politics from the Pacific Coast's Japanese immigrant worker organizations to the countercultural autodidacts of Seattle's retail sector. I really encourage you to give them a look at longhaulmag.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Okay, here's Asha Ransby-Sporn and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Asha Ransby-Sporn is a Chicago-based organizer and writer and a columnist for In These Times. She was a co-founder of Black Youth Project 100, where she led the group's national organizing program and worked on racial, economic, and gender justice issues across the U.S., and since has led a number of winning issue-based and political campaigns. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is the co-founder of Hammer and Hope, a digital magazine of race, culture, and politics. She's also the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation and a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Asha Ransby-Sporn, welcome to The Dig. And Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, welcome back.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.
The fundamental point of this interview is to figure out some answers to a big question. In your words, Keeanga, you texted me the other day, quote, "The pressing question is how we went from 26 million people on the streets to a fascist in the White House." That is a really pressing question. So to start us off on a general level before we get into a lot of particulars, Keeanga, what's your general sense of what the answer is?
I think part of it has to do with exhaustion. I think even before 2020, there had been a very kind of vibrant and active Black Lives Matter movement for Black lives, whatever you want to call it. The first really prolonged movement against racism in this country in 2 generations, long preceded the kind of acceleration of things in 2020. And I think that if you fight like you've never fought before, you get 26 million people on the streets just in that summer. There's other research that points to, during the duration of the Trump administration, from 2017 to 2021, that there were upwards of 65,000 protests involving up to 30 million people. So what happens when you engage in this level of struggle for almost a decade and really not much changes? Everything has changed and nothing has changed. There's a certain level of fatigue. I think there is a question about, does it really matter what we do when this thing just continues to chug along? I think there are questions about the relationship between the left, broadly construed progressives, and the Democratic Party, and what happens when electing Democrats at the highest level of government becomes a significant part of the objective, and they win, and then we go home. And so just as Trump's presidency saw probably the most demonstrations in the history of an American presidency. Conversely, Joe Biden's administration saw almost no protest at all until the very end, the final months of his administration, when the Palestinian solidarity struggles erupted. Those were really the first challenges to the Biden administration. So even as the Biden administration is backing away from promises that were made during the campaign, when they were forced to really try to figure out how do we transform all of this activism into votes for us. So Joe Biden goes from being the candidate who infamously in the fall of 2019 told his donors that nothing would change if he were to become president, to having to change everything. And so there was the pressure from the protests that are also what pushed him into office. But then once in office, there's almost no pressure at all from the organized forces that had the capacity to mobilize and do that. So I think there are like different explanations that then lead to a fall off that, activism and protest and political consciousness are not like water faucets. You turn it on when you need it, you turn it off before it overflows. And, it doesn't quite work like that. And so once things have been demobilized, it's very difficult to gin the machine up again, especially after almost a decade, when the question enters as to whether what we do actually matters in the first place, which of course it does. But if you see things after almost a decade are relatively in the same spot that you left them in, it becomes harder to just be like, well, it's time to be mobilized and to get out again. So, there are other specific things, I think, that have to do with Kamala Harris's campaign and, all of that we can certainly get into. But those are some of the things that I've been thinking about, at least.
Yeah. I appreciate the question. I appreciate hearing your reflections, Keeanga. And, I think it's important to ground in, 26 million people in the streets was always potential and opportunity. It wasn't itself a reflection of power. It wasn't like a moment in 2020 where there was a powerful American left. The left in this country has, isn't powerful. And, I think the question that a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to figure out is how to make it more powerful. And, what is the role of Black movement in particular inside of that has been a big part of my life and focus. And yeah, so it's 2020 felt like opportunity, potential. I think in some places there were big experiments in how do we absorb lots of these people into our organizations, into campaigns to, fight for cuts to police budget, into groups that were fighting for massive climate policy at the federal level, groups that were fighting on a number of different issues. And yeah, I certainly feel that we were not prepared to absorb all of what was possible, all of the people who could have been brought into some type of left or progressive or social change oriented organizing at that time. But I do think there's a way that we, it's not like that was a reflection of this height of movement power that then dissipated. It was like a flashpoint during which a lot of things did move. And I do think, in some contexts, we did do massive organizing around defund in Chicago. We brought thousands of people into mass training programs, got them involved at their ward level. Out of that was like a renewed movement around investing in non-police mental health crisis response in Chicago, which is something we've seen some big wins around. We've reopened free clinics. And it was like totally nowhere near the vision of what we wanted and maybe felt like what was possible when you feel the emotion of being in the streets among millions of people all around the world in the context of this pandemic that feels like it's opening space for more different things to be on the table, which in some ways it was, in some ways ideologically it was, and in a lot of ways it was a moment where I think a lot of people's eyes were open to how things could be different, but it wasn't necessarily like a fundamental shift in the power relations that existed and who held power in this country. And yeah, I think a lot of the lessons that have become sharpened for me over that period of time, during which my organizing has taken a lot of different shapes, from being in the midst of mass protest stuff and doing campaigns around the police budget, to doing electoral work, to pushing on this mental health campaign that I just mentioned, is like just how much power it really takes to change things, I think is actually a lot more than we like to talk about. And it is so, so much more than just being able to flood the streets or even having masses of people in organizing organizations, like in the reopening the mental health clinics, investing in a non-police mental health crisis response example in Chicago, which is a major win. It's like to get 2.5 clinics reopened and a pilot of a non-police mental health crisis response, it took 10, 15 years of people protesting clinic closures in Chicago. It took a pandemic context global uprising to like revive that campaign. It took like electing a bunch of people to city council, putting a referendum on the ballot, electing a mayor who made this like a campaign promise, and then like a ton of other work since then just to win this police alternative at a kind of small scale. So that's heavy and a lot, and I wish more was possible. But I think it has sharpened for me just like how much power it takes, how much power we are up against, and then like really, really clearly who's in our way. And I think, some of the failures of the Democratic Party to do more than use their power to discipline progressives is like a big part of how we got from there to here.
I wanted to say one thing, because I think the emphasis on power is really important, and I think is part of getting at some of the dynamics that took place, particularly in the summer of 2020, when I think there are a couple of reasons why corporations in particular were so quick to sort of pledge their allegiance to the idea that Black Lives Matter, is really because you could agree with that without having to really change much, right? And so if we think about what became the focal points of change in 2020, it was closing the racial wealth gap. It was focusing on racist appraisals in the housing industry, creating more Black homeowners, responding to microaggressions. There was a popular hashtag that went viral, Black in the Ivy League. And so there were these kinds of issues that really became the focal point of the media, really, of the things that corporations and elected officials would focus on while ignoring other issues that really would begin to get into what was necessary to transform the material conditions for working class Black people that had been created or exacerbated by racism. So living wage, dealing with the issues that had been exposed when a disproportionate number of Black people had become a part of this essential workers, the essential working class, healthcare, childcare, like all of those issues become submerged. And it was also, I think, an example of what Femi Taiwo describes as elite capture. And I don't even mean that in a nefarious way, that there's, some group of people who are trying to figure out how we can turn this working class Black rebellion into a platform for the grievances of the Black middle class. But I think that there is a way in which the language of systemic racism and structural racism was used and employed, but to not deal with systemic or structural issues, so that the focus almost remains exclusively on one set of issues that are important to kind of upwardly mobile Black people, while the issues of Black ordinary people are smothered. So issues of healthcare, jobs, childcare, all of these were of paramount importance during this point. And you can see sort of echoes of that now. I mean, it's different now, but take, for example, the Target boycott, right? So this call from Al Sharpton and others comes out in response to Trump's victory, that we're going to target Target because they have backed away from DEI commitments. And, whatever, that's fine. Target is a gross company that at the first opportunity decide to, renege on promises for equity within their company. But Target also, 15% of their workforce is Black. It's like something like 62,000 Black workers. And so there's this tension of, boycott Target, destroy Target. And then what does that mean for these Black people who work there? So on the one hand, it's like we want to show our power as consumers and as, people who shop at Target. And then on the other hand, what do we say to Black working class people who are there? And it's the same, there's the same thing with Walmart. There are 2 million Black people who work at Walmart. And so it's not to cast aspersions, but to look and see that there's a clash of interests. There's a clash of interest here that then create political problems in terms of, well, what is it that we're fighting for? And how do we unite a political struggle if we have different ideas of what the objectives should actually be? Is it we need more Black homeowners? Or is it we have to have a political solution for the 58% of Black people who are renters? And it's not that these have to be irreconcilably opposed to each other, but it is the case that in this political moment of insurgency, one set of issues got a maximum amount of attention, and another set of issues, I wouldn't say were completely ignored, but was much more difficult to make them the focal point. And so there are different issues with the question of power. There's the power that is necessary to actually be able to transform these. And then there's a more localized question of power in terms of whose issues become important and get taken up. And to me, it means that the question of organizing and organization then become much more important, because that has always been the only way that regular people can exert any kind of power or influence on a local level, let alone in responding to these bigger, profound social questions.
A question on the historical context before we get deeper into 2020. Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives, initially took off after the 2013 acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, and then around the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, after the 2014 police murder of Mike Brown, which was then followed in short order by the police murder of Eric Garner on Staten Island. But at the same time, BLM also quickly became associated not just with these on-the-ground movements in these various cities, but also with national level work identified closely with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. How did the first round of Black Lives Matter play out, and how did it lay the groundwork for what happened 6 years later or so in 2020?
I was a very young new organizer in a room full of Black organizers from around the country when the acquittal of George Zimmerman happened. And that sparked some of us founding something called BYP 100, which kind of happened alongside, a milieu of organizations. I think Dream Defenders is another important one to name. And yeah, it felt like we were starting something that was uniquely ours in terms of our generation of really Black millennials, and creating homes for us to organize. And the Trayvon Martin moment, it was meaningful to those of us who were involved, and there were big protests. But then when Ferguson happened a year later, it was even bigger. And so even just that year of incubating organization, I think, was really important for the formation of movement. And those years are a big part of why I feel like even going into 2020, I had a lens to say, hey, these big moments of protest are massive opportunity. And it's the opportunity out of which we built BYP 100, the organization that I came out of as a kind of organizing vehicle. But we were always much smaller than the movement as a whole itself. After the Eric Garner protests in New York City, we had monthly membership orientations with 100 people coming in, but that's out of the 60,000 people that were in the protests that weekend. And so just even those numbers, I think, speak to how we were and weren't able to capture the energy out of protest. And yeah, I will say that the movement, both kind of iterations of the movement that you're talking about, were very focused on policing. And even the politics around that did shift over time. Whereas 2013, very few people were talking about abolition, for example. It was in 2014 that in Chicago, we really started talking about the police budget. And in many places, that wasn't quite a frame that was being used yet. And slowly, the movement started adopting this framework of invest and divest. If we're going to be talking about police killings, we can't just be talking about kind of small scale reforms like body cameras and police training. We should really be thinking about, as Keeanga was talking about, I feel like what you were getting at was, are we making demands that actually shift who has power in society in a structural way? And I think the framework of invest and divest was to say, hey, decades of neoliberal reforms have divested from Black communities, has created greater inequality. And what are we left with? Over-policed communities with underfunded or non-existent schools, community centers, resources. Let's think about safety and public safety as actually flipping that. So that was a set of ideas that you saw cooking and people sharpening their politics around. And that became increasingly dominant among organizers who were building Black organization out of that earlier era, which kind of laid the groundwork for then why you see defund become the kind of popular demand coming out of 2020. And I think just to relate it back to the demands that maybe weren't so central, I do think in a lot of Black organizing spaces, there was not a lot of clarity about socialism, about, there was a general sense of we're anti-capitalist, maybe, but we're pro-Black lives, we're anti-police. And there is I think this sharpening that did not actually happen in terms of what is the affirmative vision of what we're for. How do we relate to the state more broadly? and what's our vision for kind of economic life for Black people. And I think if we are making the strongest set of demands that are going to improve people's lives, that actually has to be central to it. And increasingly, I feel like it's important that we're talking about Black left movement or Black movement inside of a broader left to help us get just clearer about that piece.
I think this movement, this kind of era of Black Lives Matter that begins in 2012 in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin, that eventually becomes Black Lives Matter, is so important because it really brings the issue of racism as a fact of American life back to the surface of American society. The earlier iteration of Black insurgency, social movement of the 1960s had been so disruptive to American life that the American state spent a generation just trying to destroy its legacy, either through the physical repression of Black revolutionaries, through a political agenda bent on denying that racism existed, and investing heavily in the narrative of Black domestic dysfunction as the source of Black inequality, of social disparities. And that had largely succeeded. It was the kind of dominant political view, not just of the bipartisan American state, right? The Democratic Party was just as invested in distancing itself from the idea of helping, grow the state by dealing with the problems in Black communities. They were just as invested in shifting that narrative away from structural inequality and racism to creating this mythology of cultural problems as at root of Black inequality. And so, the emergence of Black Lives Matter in the twilight of Barack Obama's second term as president really helps to bury this idea. And I think in some ways it was, if Obama was a kind of last ditch effort of American liberalism, providing any kind of coherent direction, he brought Black people with him, but Black Lives Matter was evident of a break with that, a break that I think continues to be broken. This idea that liberal politics can save us. It doesn't mean that people have figured out what to replace it with, but I think that kind of liberalism embodied by Barack Obama and the scolding of Black people has been broken, and Black Lives Matter is the reason for that. I think really that what the movement does is it brings to the surface Black inequality as structural, as what people describe as systemic, even if it's not clear on what the system is or what the nature of the structure is. It becomes evident that this is more than just bad feelings and the indiscretion of, individual behavior, but that there's something more organized and systematic here at work, which is crucial. And it provides a model of what to do about things that you disagree with, that you don't like. And that is to engage in political struggle. And again, this is coming after a time of the long shadow cast by 9/11, where political struggle had been marginalized, had been literally pushed to the margins, pushed out of the streets from the late 1990s, where there were campaigns around racial profiling, there were campaigns around globalization. All of that had been wiped out by 9/11. And so Occupy Wall Street, which is very much, then connected to the eruption of Black Lives Matter, brings all of that back into the norm. And not just as a thing that people do, but that is seen approvingly. And so the final part of that I will say is that I think the impact of that by 2020 means that millions of white people participate in these protests, because part of what the movement is doing is giving language to Black people to explain what is happening in Black communities, but it is also demonstrating to white people what is happening in Black communities in ways that, when you live in a society that is as deeply segregated as the one we inhabit, is not always apparent. It's not always apparent that there's a police state in Black communities where the police can come and just do whatever the hell they want to do. That, there is a housing crisis, that Black schools are funded in different ways, because of residential segregation. All of this becomes part of the mainstream discussion by 2019 and 2020. And I think that because the Democratic Party is so afraid that Black voter turnout is going to drop because Barack Obama is no longer at the top of the ticket, that they can't just turn the page and move on from questions of race, that they have to remain engaged with these issues because they're trying to remain engaged with the Black community in hopes that Black voters will turn out. So Hillary Clinton can't just rest on her laurels with older Black people, that she's forced to engage with these young Black activists. And it becomes headline news when, I think it's in February of 2016, she uses the phrase systemic racism to describe what is happening in Black communities, especially in relationship to the criminal justice system. And, we can look cynically upon that because Hillary Clinton, of course, does it for cynical reasons, but it also impacts a lot of white people to hear this mainstream candidate talk about systemic racism in Black communities. And that is happening because there are Black Lives Matter activists who are trailing her around the country, forcing her to take responsibility for her invocation of the disgusting phrase super predator, to take account for the role of she and Bill Clinton in mass incarceration as a phenomenon in Black communities. And so all of this is critical, I think, to the particular character that 2020 has, which is some social scientists who look at these things have estimated that up to 52% of the 26 million people who were protesting were white, 20% were Black, 20% were Latino, but that this was really a multiracial uprising. And I think that part of the reason for that is the impact of the previous 7 or 8 years of Black Lives Matter and really educating the American public about the effects of racism in American society.
Yeah, to follow up on what brought people to the streets that summer, the Black communist Harry Haywood once said, quote, "Black liberation is the slogan of unity." And looking back 5 years, it seems that a major driver of the numbers and also the energy in the streets had a lot to do with police murder of Black people and racism, but also with the height of the pandemic, the mass disease and death, the pent-up frustrations around the lockdown, the devastation, the economic devastation that people were feeling because of the destruction of so much of the bottom rungs of the labor market, but also the hope inspired by the fact that the state can actually step in. It has the actual power to step in and ameliorate that kind of pain through spending. And it seems to me that in some ways the movement, the protests addressed these issues, linking, as you mentioned earlier, Asha, austerity to policing, divest, invest, and so providing a sort of framework to think about that all together. What for you both was the entirety of what was going on, bringing so many people to the streets in 2020, and what the whole thing was then really about? And to what extent was the struggle in 2020 able to link up these questions of Black life, freedom, police brutality to these other social and political issues of that conjuncture, issues that hit Black people so hard, but really also, of course, hit the entirety of the working class, these forms of immiseration that were becoming ever more generalized? Were there seeds of a broad unity within 2020's paradigm of Black liberation?
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing COVID into the mix, which I think is, just as much, if not greater, social conditions backdrop to the fact that the protests emerged at the scale that they did in the summer of 2020. And, I can't understate like the uniqueness of people across race, across class, across the globe, like their world being upside down in one way or another in the context of COVID. And the way in which, distinct from some of the earlier uprisings and rebellions like Ferguson and in other places that were very Black and very working class, 2020 was uniquely multiracial, and probably uniquely cross-class as well. And so, yeah, I do think the context of COVID, like you're saying, people's eyes being open to the like historic misaligned priorities of our government, what is kind of uniquely possible and what could be even more possible. I think, the way that people were comparing what the COVID response looked like in the US compared to places where there's a universal healthcare system, like that was a very alive debate. And then COVID also hits as we were seeing the kind of end and consolidation of a really progressive Democratic primary. And, it was in Illinois, the lockdown started like a few days before our primary. I think it had become clear just before COVID lockdown started that Bernie didn't have a shot anymore. But, this was like Bernie and Elizabeth Warren in 2020. And then ultimately we get the kind of most status quo Democratic Party nominee. And there's like lots more to say about how that happens and how hard it is for leftists to win a Democratic primary, and the fact that we don't have a left political party in this country. And like, maybe if we did, there would be more possible out of these moments where people actually want something different and more. But you have that, you have COVID hit. There's before even the George Floyd protests, there's massive calls for rent freezes, for protecting essential workers, which is like the most kind of, you see a pro-labor slogan really penetrating into just like the mainstream in a really different type of way. You see conversations about stimulus checks, like when has some like just guaranteed basic amount of resources been something that's like on the table politically? So I think people's eyes were open to what should our government be doing in moments of crisis, seeing little bits of what alternatively might be possible that didn't seem like it was before, and contrasted with the utter brutality and ongoing consistency of state and state-sanctioned murder and violence against Black people. I think it was the combination and the contrast and the dissonance between those things that was uniquely visibilized to a much broader set of people who were feeling like, one, the needs that they had that were being unmet by the society that we live in a unique way that informs why those uprisings were so big and multiracial. And it was about so much more than policing. We just had a frame and a movement logic where we've been mobilizing in response to these types of instances that I think offered an outlet for a much more complex set of dynamics. And, I think the state murdering people in broad daylight is like as visceral and mobilizing and horrible an example of like all the misaligned priorities that people were seeing come to a head as any to respond to.
I think that there were lots of different issues that propelled people into the streets without a doubt. But I also think that the overriding issue was anti-racism. And what I said before in terms of the ways that Black Lives Matter had focused the nation on the condition of Black people was certainly relevant. I think, and you could see this in the Democratic Party primary that began in 2019. I don't know if people remember, but there was such a desperate jockey to be seen as the candidate who had the right answer to the question of do Black Lives Matter. Even Pete Buttigieg had a Frederick Douglass plan, right? Like Elizabeth Warren had a plan to redress historic redlining. Kamala Harris, if she released a biography in January of 2019, but I didn't read it, but one of my student advisees who just wrote a 170-page thesis about Black politics and Black feminism read it. And, Kamala Harris sounds like a socialist, And so there's like a race to catch up with Bernie, but within that is to be seen as the Black Lives Matter candidate, which of course is wild, we think about it in this particular moment. So there was a particular kind of focus on what was happening with Black people. And then the pandemic happens. And in the month of April, right, the first full month of the pandemic, Black people are dying at an unprecedented, insane rate. 39 people per 100,000. Compared to white people, it's 16 per 100,000. I think for Latinos, it's like 20 per 100,000. Of course, these change over time, but at that moment of what is this and what is happening, the deaths of Black people are outstripping everyone in a way that was completely frightening if you happen to be Black or live in a Black community. And so this is all taking place while everyone is at home, which I think slows the news cycle down, that gives people time to linger on things that previously and since the news cycle, it just chews through events that you don't actually have time to think about them. You don't have time to ruminate about them. This was different. We got the inside story on what was happening with Ahmaud Arbery, what happened with Breonna Taylor. And then when George Floyd is killed, it's like it becomes an all-absorbing story. And so these things kind of come together that really, I think, just trigger the anger and alienation that had also been stoked by the completely inept response of the US government to this historic crisis. And so I agree with Asha when she says that there is this convergence of weird, historic, strange events that happen in this particular moment that lend themselves to an explosion. And I think probably the thing that might send it over the top is you have a president who, in every other situation, even among the right, they're in moments of racial uprising and these kinds of situations, even from the right, there is an effort to express some empathy, to calm things down, to, the nation will overcome this. And instead, you have a provocateur who is the president, who, I think initially said something about George Floyd, but then very quickly pivots to calling protesters thugs, to using his own security detail to tear gas demonstrators in a park so that he can have near the White House so that he can have a photo op. A president who decides he's going to have a political rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Juneteenth, right? Like 2 weeks into massive uprisings against racism across the country, and who's basically telling people to go fuck themselves every step of the way throughout this, which it just contributes to the apoplexy of not just Black people, but of anyone with any sense of human decency. It's like, what is this guy doing? And it compels people along with the corruption that he represents and the hypocrisy and, bailing out billionaires and corporations who are suffering losses as a result of the pandemic, and then nickel-and-diming the public, letting us know every penny that we receive and the demand that we should be grateful that our government is giving us anything. I think that the confluence of this psychosis really sort of lends itself to this unprecedented, this will never happen again, this unprecedented kind of outpouring.
Asha, you write, quote, contemporary Black movements have largely failed to consolidate the momentum of our heightened periods of activity into power at the scale some of us felt was possible or necessary. Many organizations were not built to absorb or develop people at scale. Where rapid growth did happen, internal conflict ensued. Divisive efforts separated movements from a more moderate mainstream Black political class. The dominant tendency toward decentralization and sweeping anti-institutional sentiment made it difficult for organizations or leaders to put forth and implement credible strategies for attaining the power we needed to deliver on our visions. And often, the conversation around policing didn't successfully land in a way that clearly connected to an affirmative agenda. There's a lot there that's really insightful. And I think the issues you point out on capacity are really important and not necessarily particular to Black organizations, but really extend to the left more generally. We all paid, I think, a high price for entering a mass movement moment without structures in place that could direct or absorb even really a modest portion of those masses of people. How do you two think about the relationship between building durable structures that can wield power in political and economic struggles, labor unions, tenant unions, cadre organizations, groups like BYP that were in place from, I think, 2013 on, whatever, how those structure-based organizations then should relate to moments like 2020, these mass movement moments when everyone suddenly pours into the streets, movements that, as Keeanga mentioned, we cannot turn on and off like water. When they come, they're coming. How should we think about that, and how did that play out in 2020?
I have been rooted in Black movement. That's where I'm situated, and that's where my critique there is focused. And I just will caveat to say that I by no means am intending to exceptionalize that critique to us. It's just what I'm looking at, what I've lived. There's like a couple of ways that I read and hear that back is like, one, what we felt like was possible in these heightened moments was so big. And I think that that's like important to honor. And like part of that sentence is just saying like what we felt like was possible was so big. And I think it's good to experience that and use that and let that transform people and bring more people into leadership. I think it's out of that feeling that it's not just that lots of people are in the streets, it's that lots of people are in the streets and it's changing them. That is the opportunity to really bring people into, honestly, lifelong commitments to making the world better. That is what it makes so much possible. And there is no world in which we have capacity, like not every single person is going to get brought into being a member of an organization. And I think as time changes, as technology changes, as people relate to one another, we like forever should iterate on how we absorb people. But that framework of absorption, of saying like people being mobilized in the streets means that they're onto something, they're feeling something, they're a part of that moment. And there's the potential to bring them into something more sustained and into relationship with one another, so we can organize and fight together. And then just relating that back. And yeah, our organizations mostly are not set up for that. And it is a different structure. Like in BYP, we were kind of founded out of some big movement moments. And then there were lulls. And I do think it's a struggle to adapt your organizational structure to actually work well in both of those types of moments. I think it's like interesting for organizers to think about how we build that so we can, exist in slow times and in fast times and take advantage of those things adequately. And I've been on the phone a bit with some folks who are in St. Louis who experienced this tornado 2 weeks ago, and watching, leaders like Kayla Reed at Action St. Louis, which was founded out of the Ferguson uprisings in 2014, like 11 years later, have an organization that is doing, in the absence of FEMA workers under Trump, like the direct response and mobilizing and organizing thousands of people in another type of crisis. Anyway, just one is an example of speaking to like, yeah, we can build durable things out of these moments. And there's 1,000,001 types of crises that our people are going to continue to face, whether it's a mass protest moment or a disaster or something else. And those are all times when we should be thinking about our capacity to absorb people for the long haul. Yeah, there's a lot I could say here. I think just briefly on the point around decentralization and kind of anti-institutionalism, this is a very strong tendency in our movement. I think I have watched a lot of us be kind of like liberal about it. And, in some ways, it's individualism. It's saying like, hey, I would rather think about my politics as like an identity and a thing I'm going to hold on to and keep really precious to myself, as opposed to something I like do out in the world in collaboration with other people that maybe means I need to be a part of something bigger than myself. That means I'm going to be accountable to a strategy. And I think our people really struggle with being a part of things and sticking with them. And I think we've seen that tendency most heightened post big uprisings, post rapid growth of organizations, where lots of new people come in and they feel like there's 1,000,001 ways to be like, to take action in the world. And I don't need to be in something with lots and lots of other people making democratic decisions or following a leader that, may be directing things in a way that I don't agree with every step of the way. And that's not to say we should just all fall in line or people shouldn't have autonomy and feel good in their organizations. But I do think if we're talking about building massive people power, which means coordinating many, many people, we do need to be willing to be a part of things that are bigger than ourselves and be willing to step into some of the discipline that allows us to support strong leadership, to be a part of democratic decisions, and even, following some of those things, even if they land differently than, where we may have wanted, especially if we're quite new. Those are a couple of things. It's hard.
Briefly, just to quote some lines from you on this, Keeanga, you wrote, quote, "The movement's lack of a political center and its inability to cohere around political ideas, strategy, or tactics created an atmosphere of freelancing. Everyone did their own thing." That that's from a recent piece in Hammer and Hope. In an article you wrote for Jacobin, I think maybe 6 years ago or so, you wrote about, quote, the tyranny of structurelessness in the age of social media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issues that Asha raises and that I obviously have been thinking about for a while are not unique to the movement for Black lives. It, in some ways, it's an American inheritance, at least over the last 2 generations, the kind of suspicion of organization and the almost fetish of decentralization, political freelancing, as a way to kind of circumvent the organization question. But I think that we really see the consequence of that. I mean, it's been consequential before, but in 2020, I mean, it is very difficult to try to develop organizations in the midst of a flood. So if we want to continue with the faucet metaphor, like when the water is running full tilt is the worst time to then be like, well, now's the time we have to build an organization. It defies physics that, in the midst of 26 million people, that any group had the capacity to do anything with that. Which is why it was comical that some people, and not just with Black Lives Matter, were trying to, say that in Philly, right, the Party for Socialism and Liberation put up a post on Facebook, I think on June 5th, that 80,000 people showed up for. They showed up to a protest that group called. But give me a break, right? Like that group has, at that point, I don't know, 20 or 30 people in Philly, maybe, did not organize 80,000 people, right? That was the nature of things in 2020. Like high school students put up a post and thousands of people show up. So nobody was organizing anything. The issue is, what do we do outside of those moments of sheer, insurgency? And I think that it means that we have to win political arguments on the question of democracy and on the question of political accountability, meaning that this idea that most recently popularized through Occupy, picked up then by BLM, that we don't need leaders, or that we don't need leaders or everyone's a leader, but no one is responsible for making decisions. That essentially that you do what feels right for you. You do what you think is the right thing, is an incoherent way to intervene in politics. And it's dishonest. Of course there are leaders. The issue isn't whether there are people making decisions and whether there's leadership. The question is whether there is accountability and that they are taking responsibility for the decisions that they make, not for the purposes of recrimination, but how do we organize a discussion about what happened, what went right, what went wrong, what do we do next, if there's no accountability for any decisions that are being made? And then the question of democracy is how we sort of account for that decision making, and how one of the things that I value about my political experience, which certainly predates the internet age, was the value of having to be in rooms with people that you had to convince of something, or not, or fail in convincing of something. But there was value in learning how to have a political argument over a particular issue, that now, there's a way to completely circumvent that. And if you don't want to engage, you don't really have to. And so we lose the capacity to engage in political debate and discussion, which really makes it difficult for us then to be able to engage with a larger audience that don't agree with us about most things, that you actually have to be able to convince if we are going to grow as a left. If you're going to grow, it necessarily means that you have to engage with people you don't agree with. And if we can't do that within our own organizations, or if we're afraid to do that, then it makes it that much more difficult to do that with the public. And the unwillingness to do that because either you're afraid of losing an argument, or that you don't want to engage with people who have bad politics, who may be homophobic, who say sexist things, then again, we are limiting our ability to actually expand. And so I thought that in 2020, there were kind of a confluence of these issues. But I think one of the things that also stood out to me was the way that the lack of political accountability didn't just limit the kind of influence and growth of the movement itself, but it allowed smaller groups of people to speak on behalf of the movement itself. And so then you get these deals that are made in the name of the movement. So I think that there were parts of Black Lives Matter and the groupings around Bernie that were bought off for cheap, right? The DNC, the Democratic National Convention, basically said, you guys figure it out amongst yourselves, but you guys can write the platform, the DNC platform for 2020. And if you read the DNC platform for 2020, I mean, it is the most radical thing that the Democratic Party has ever published or put out. I mean, it's kind of wild to read it. But what did it matter? They tore it up. There were also people with BLM, I'm not exactly sure who, but who participated in this writing. And it's not, I feel like sometimes we talk about these things, it's seen as devious and nefarious. I don't think it's that. I think that people believe that if we have a seat at the table, that it's better than not having a seat at the table, and that we can influence things. And I think, there's an effort, lots of effort put into making that seem like a real idea. Obama invited BLM activists to the White House, right? And I think when you compare that to the reception now, is it better to have the ear of people in power, or is it better to be completely ostracized? So I can understand like where that idea comes from, but often it comes in place of this other stuff, which is harder to do and harder to facilitate and organize. And so here we end up with a focus on writing the DNC platform, a focus on getting Biden elected, a focus then on the Georgia Senate races, as these are the most important things that we can do to change the political circumstance under which we are organizing. And then it also means that there are no protests that are really happening during the Biden administration, that is also part of the deal. There's no like, if we do this, then you won't protest. It's more subtle than that. It's, well, we should give them time, right? That they're trying to work, their people and have these discussions, and we should give them time to do that. It's more subtle. It looks like that. But the problem is that as we slowly demobilize things and give into a logic that it's just better for us to have these people in power, that it becomes more complicated to then rev everything back up when we need people to appear again. And so how do you overcome that? I don't think there's some secret formula that if we just build the right organization that we can overcome what are really structural issues. But I do think that if we have democratic, accountable political organizations, it gives us more of an opportunity to debate and argue about these things that might produce a different outcome than groups of people making decisions on their own as an alternative.
I think that the post-Biden lack of sustained protests that you're talking about is, I do think a lot of it was a kind of popping the balloon of energy that looked like disinterest in politics and disinterest in the dealings of the Democratic Party among a lot of movement participants, maybe more so, or at least in addition to some sense that people who were actively involved were then getting behind the Democrats. I think it became unclear to folks without being inside of some type of competitive race where there is some alternative thing that's on the table, and outside of moments of just sheer outrage like we have so consistently under Trump. How do we relate to a corporate Democrat in office who's better than he was for most of his career in Congress, better than he was under Obama, but still not great, until we have, his stance on the genocide, I think then sharpens things again. So it's this lack of conflict almost, and this lack of party. And then I think this disappointment that came after a lot of people saw hey, maybe progressives or leftists can actually take over the Democratic Party. You see some of the losses in the 2020 primary. Then there's some energy again in the 2022 primary where some progressives win again. But I feel in that time, very alive were debates around how much energy do we put into electoral politics and what is actually possible to win in the terrain of the Democratic Party. And then I also think you saw a lot of organizations that may have been waging some of those fights, dealing with some of the aftermath of the pressure that came with 2020 and the period after that, in a way that made it really difficult to lead on the left. And I don't think we had a clear script or a clear how do we actually intervene in this context where I think the 2020 protests are a massive part of increased turnout that helped elect Biden, but I don't think that was our goal. It just happened.
I'm Micah Utricht, editor of Jacobin. You're listening to The Dig, a podcast that brings you an incredibly wide-ranging analysis of politics, history, economics, and more, covering the entire planet at a consistent depth that, frankly, I find a little hard to comprehend. I'm not sure exactly how Dan does it, but I'm pretty sure it's connected to you supporting the podcast at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com, and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Fake Work: How I Began to Suspect Capitalism is a Joke by Lee Claire LaBerge. The year is 1999, and the world is about to end. The only thing standing between corporate America and certain annihilation is a freshly employed 22-year-old and her 3-ring binder. In this genre-bending memoir, LaBerge reflects on her stint at one of the most prestigious management consulting firms in the country and what it teaches us about the absurdity of work. As Melinda Cooper puts it, at once hilarious and deadly serious, LaBerge's Chronicle of the Absurd tells us more about the logic of contemporary capitalism than any work of standard economic history or organization theory. Find Fake Work at haymarketbooks.org, where all hardcover books are 10% off every day. 2021 to October 2023 is an interesting, complex period because there really is a substantive left turn in terms of Biden's economic team. And if the initial Build Back Better had passed, that really could have been transformative in a deeply felt way, unlike anything Democrats had done since the height of the New Deal. But because of the political dynamic in Congress created very much by the neoliberalization of the Democratic Party and the destruction of the labor movement, which left Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema with a veto of that, it became a much more underwhelming and to ordinary voters entirely invisible Inflation Reduction Act. And then you have sort of like a reprise of the contradictions of the Johnson administration, where domestic reform is paired with an intensification, a doubling down on liberal commitment to bloody, murderous American empire, with the steadfast support for Israel's genocide in Gaza, support for Israel that's not really paralleled by any Democrat or Republican's past support for Israel. There had always been a moment, including Reagan in Beirut, where the American president would pick up the phone and say, okay, we're done. And that never happened. And then and then this kind of like slow kind of unraveling of this left Biden partnership explodes into the most brutal form of political conflict imaginable.
I'll just say, I don't think, going back some, but then taking up your point, Dan, I don't think the kind of maneuvering around the 2020 election was about kind of naked, unbridled support for the